Today we'll be talking to the rector of the Stockholm School of Economics, Mr. Anderss Pālzovs, and we will discuss generative AI, education, and the impact of those two things on society. So if we talk about like artificial intelligence, right, and then Swedish School of Economics is educating lots of new managers, new leaders, people who will be at the helm of their own firms or in the industry. So how do you see how does it change education for you?
I think it's really a game changer in the sense that we've been quite good or very good at kind of training them on, if I'm a bit cynical, mechanical stuff. You get kind of good at Excel, you're very good at kind of calculating the value of an option and so forth. And of course, there will be a need for that even in the future, but not to that extent, and you cannot build a career on that. So what I see and where I think we really have to change is that we have to work more on the softer skills of the students. Students need to kind of develop, what should we call it, critical thinking, of course, but also other parts of the kind of personality, like empathy, for example. So really a shift, which I'm not sure students always appreciate, because it's much easier to do kind of another calculation, another way of calculating option price, rather than working on kind of your leadership skills and the softer aspects. So I think that will be one thing. The other one is, of course, and that means we as educators, we have to start understanding the challenges that comes with this shift, and also how that will kind of impact. And our graduates, they graduate 2 weeks from now, they will be in labor market 50 years. So we talk about a very long time span. Yes. And of course we cannot prepare them for everything, but we can give them at least a basis so they can go on further. So I think if you compare to what we do now in comparison to what we will do a few years from now, you will see still a lot of quantitative stuff, but a bigger share of qualitative stuff as such.
There were different reactions when ChatGPT kind of took off, and one thing I saw, admittedly on Instagram, is that now we can stop learning how to write thesis. So what do you think about how much people still need fundamental skills like arithmetic, writing thesis, reading?
At least, okay, we see what future brings, but we kind of state-of-the-art technology today, you still need a lot of critical thinking, and I have should we call it kind of very good case that someone tried to use it, some of our students tried to use it, writing on the gender pay gap in Latvia, and it started very nicely, and then the algorithm kind of didn't find too much on the gender pay gap, so all of a sudden the thesis had lost its focus, kind of went from the gender pay gap to female board representation, for example. So it could be a helpful tool for students, but still you need to kind of think. It could help you finding sources, but you need to think, and that's why I think critical thinking is even more important now and in the future in comparison to yesterday.
And I'm fascinated because every time something like this happens, people kind of wait, okay, we've got the calculator, we can like stop learning how to calculate. And then typically the answer is no,
exactly.
No way,
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one thing. And the other one is that careers will look very, very different. You will not make a career being kind of superstar on Excel anymore. You still need to know Excel. You still need to understand the basics behind it. But the machine will do it so much better. So if you today, what should we say, if you spend, let's say, 3/4 of your time doing Excel, you will not do that anymore in the future. You will still probably be employed, but your tasks would have been redefined, and you would kind of use different skill set.
And then if you look at at companies, you're saying Excel will disappear. Kind of, I'm comparing this to the automatic trading, which has decreased the need for human traders, right? And then kind of the feeling that I get is that we can use generative AI to do the same thing, across industries. So we would have, automatic operations, for example, right? So you wouldn't need, somebody like Tim Cook to understand where are the opportunities in the supply chain. So what is your perspective from the academia side on this?
I would say exactly, more or less exactly the same. So if you look at a thing, kind of doing research, so if you compare it to when I started a long time ago, my PhD education, you read an article, you looked at the references, you went to the university library, you found half of the references there, yes. And then the other half, you asked them to kind of order. It took like 4 weeks to get, and you got photocopies of it, and you had forgotten. Why did I order it, or I solved the problem mathematically or whatever, so I didn't need it. So when the internet came and that made like resources available right away, productivity in terms of research went up tremendously. Mm-hmm. And I would say now when we could have someone kind of being much, much faster in terms of going through the sources, looking for information. Mm-hmm. That will have an enormous impact, not only on research, but I would say also students when they work, when they are students, but also when they work, that you will be able to get information in a much faster way. On the other hand, again, critical thinking will be very, very important, because now AI will search the internet, and we know some things are good, some are not so reliable or good on the internet. So you cannot just sit there and have your report produced, because you need to add what you can do as a human being, and that is, among other things, some sort of critical thinking. Because why should I, as an employer, hire a student or a graduate from SSC Riga if AI can do it right away? I do not need need someone just to type in the question, and that comes from me anyway. So it will change. It will be kind of really interesting to see.
It's a really important point, because a little bit like with blockchain, like lots of people talk about blockchain, but rarely, who has read the article that defines, how the blockchain algorithm works. And then if you don't know exactly how it works, it's virtually impossible to strategize or like even think about that. And also from artificial intelligence perspective, the system cannot make choices.
Exactly.
Right. So and then if you ask the system the same question several times, it will give you several answers. Right. So that's built into the algorithm, more or less. Right. So in every point where there needs to be a choice made, then we need a human being. Right. But then the concept, maybe we're kind of approaching it from a bit of a different perspective. The concept of business education is actually pretty new, right? Like at the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, we had fundamental education. It was, philosophy many times. Then economics appeared, in 19th century. Some of the biggest minds, like, Mr. Drucker, he was not like a business person. He was educated in kind of much more fundamental topics. And then business education in the form of, MBAs and, bachelor business degrees has, produced a revolution in how we operate companies, how we create companies, right? But there's always this, balance between, very application-driven business education and the fundamentals of what you mentioned, human psychology, human sociology, economics as a fundamental subject. So if you continue this into the next 70 years, how do you see business education versus fundamental education balancing?
That's a good question. So I think there will still be business education as such. So when we started, or when business education started at business schools in Germany or wherever in the late 1800s, there was a lot of accounting, a lot of mechanical stuff, and not very much else. And then gradually it is still there, but the share of the total time spent on that is less. And the way I see it is, this will shrink not only accounting, but finance-related topics in general. We kind of, their share will shrink at the expense. You will have more. You will kind of focus more on broadening the business student, kind of making him or her kind of develop their human skills. Again, it comes back to what defines a human, so human being. So we will work more on that while still providing the business context. So yeah, I hope my accounting colleagues will not watch this, but less of accounting, less of mechanical stuff, and more towards a kind of directional philosophy. Because if you're going to be a good decision maker in tomorrow, the way I see it, you have to have a broader general understanding. You have to have a bit of philosophy. You have to be able in many ways to really ask the right questions. So not only asking the right question, but also understanding the answer as such, and be really a critical reader, because what we see now from, let's say, ChatGPT, if you're not kind of attentive, it looks like a very, very good story being told in perfect English language. But if you have a bit of kind of critical thinking, then you start understanding the shortcomings in the way it is presented, and also the shortcomings in its, call it, academic content.
And then in the last, 20, 30 years, and then you've seen both, the Swedish educational ecosystem and the Latvian educational ecosystem. How did things change, in those last years, in the last couple of decades?
So we have, which I think is not that good, and Sweden is kind of in this ahead of Latvia, but we see the same tendency in Latvia, that students, when graduating from grade 12 or from secondary school, they are in general weaker in mathematics. And the way I see it, and the way I have experienced, is that mathematics is a very good predictor when it comes to business education or to education in general, because it helps you structuring, it gives you a way of thinking, it gives you a way of approaching problems. And then there might be people saying, very good, with artificial intelligence, we do not need math anymore, we do not need whatever anymore. But I would say on the contrary. So the big thing being that students, when they come into higher education, be it in Latvia, be it in Sweden, they are weaker in math, and we see we see the effects of that, not only in math-related topics like finance and economics, but I would say overall, because math is so much more than simply the numbers as such. It's a way of thinking.
And then also kind of approaching educational system from another perspective. Latvia is now below 2 million country, right? And Sweden is about 10 million, right? But then the competition is with the UK, where the natural language is English, with Germany, which is much bigger. So educational system, or the business of educating people, it's also competitive.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's also pretty competitive, and especially with with open Europe and with all of the openness, in the end of the day, kids, they really choose. And kids with, the largest chances of being accepted, they choose even more actively exercise their choice. So how do you see for like very small countries like Latvia, and then let's say mid-range countries in Europe like Sweden, so what should be our strategic choices in making sure that, we do have strong educational establishments?
Yeah, well, first one, I think that comes from more or less from business, or from strategy, that you have, if you're small, you have to specialize. We have to realize that, be it Sweden, be it Latvia, we cannot offer a full range, because then everything will be kind of average. Yes. or below average. So I think really to be able to specialize, and then now with the mobility, and we saw it in 2004, 2005, when Latvia joined the EU, and students all of a sudden had an option, really to leave the country, that our competition, we are very small, but still our competition is essentially not in Latvia or in the Baltic countries. It's in the Netherlands, in the UK, it's Germany, Denmark, where education is offered in English. And we see the same, I would say, in Sweden, that we realize in Sweden that to compete, to be able to offer an attractive educational offering, we have to do it in English language, and that is painful in Sweden, it's painful here, but we have to do that because students, they want to do it in English language, and if you do it in English language, you can recruit faculty worldwide, essentially, and you can provide an attractive educational offering. So there is a balance, because if you're going to work in Latvian society, if you're going to work in Swedish society, of course, you also should be able to communicate your field of specialization in your native language, so to say.
I was having the same discussion in Israel, right? And they have, unique situation. They have recreated their language, right, Hebrew, and now they have a very strong educational system. And then their approach is that they use English books, like more or less strictly American textbooks, and then it kind of gives it a balance of kind of bilingual education, right? And then the argument for that is also pretty interesting, that to produce a good textbook, and then better than I do, you need to produce several, and then a couple of them become leading ones, and then you rely on those, and then the next generation of professors will write the new generation of books, right? So, in a country like Israel, it is, again, virtually impossible to write, a couple of two good textbooks, let's say, on macroeconomics, right? But then approaching maybe, artificial intelligence education from another perspective, the society is, the Gini coefficient is going in the wrong direction. The society is, is separating into, classes or, ranks, whatever we call that. So what is your sense? What would be the most, let's say, immediate, the simplest impact of artificial intelligence? Is it going to create a more equal society, or it will contribute to worsening of the current trend?
That's really a tricky one, and there are, I think it's very much, in that sense, in the hands of the policymakers, how they meet the challenges in terms of retraining people. So if we are successful in retraining people that are laid off, in people whose current skills become obsolete or no need for them whatsoever, then I think we will create a more equal society. On the other hand, if we do not manage to retrain or upskill people, then it would go in the other direction. So I think actually here policymakers have a very clear choice in coming from education. It's no secret what I support here.
Well, absolutely. Because in the internet revolution case, I think, from our industry perspective, we did have a type of a big mistake, that there was a lot of expectation that free internet will create free societies, right? And we didn't really look at how, free internet would impact, the psychology and sociology of societies, because probably we could have seen some of those trends happening, already in the 90s and 2000s, right? So right now the industry is much more careful in kind of predicting things, and much more careful in expecting only the the good outcomes. But in general, my sense is that the overall trend is towards worsening of the separation of, for example, different economic classes. And when you think about new generation of folks coming to, for example, to the Swedish school, what is your recommendation, on what basis people should choose, what one type of education and the other type of education? I mean, your school is one of the most popular schools, and many people want to get in because it is such a great institution. But then you also see that, you know, sometimes it's a good match, sometimes it's not a good match. Looking at the personality of of kids coming in.
Yes, so there I think it's really, you should listen to your heart. You should do what you really want to do, because yeah, we can kind of draw a parallel to Sweden, Latvia, Sweden ice hockey game the other day. That Swedes, they came here, they met a highly motivated team, and they totally failed. And to me, the failure there was because of lack of motivation, lack of kind of not taking the other team, in this case Latvia, seriously. And what I see in our place with the students is exactly the same. You mentioned it's a popular place. So even though we interview candidates before they are admitted, some people get in and it's very, very obvious. They are there because it's a nice place, it's kind of nice people around, but they are not motivated, they are not dedicated, and then it ends up kind of signing out from SSC Riga after a year, after two, without a diploma, and then kind of hopefully then listening to the heart and go and study architecture or IT or whatever they are interested in. So I think the general recommendation is really do what kind of your heart tells you, because that is when you will be able to be kind of kind of have the motivation, have the energy to go through higher education.
It's a great advice. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
Yes,
Thanks.
Thank you.